Alright guys, Dominic here for Kit Guru, and today we are back looking at not one, but two RX 5700 XTs. Both cards are from Gigabyte, and we are comparing the RX 5700 XT Gaming OC to the Aorus RX 5700 XT. For those who don't know, Aorus is Gigabyte's kind of premium sub-brand, and at the time of writing that is reflected in the pricing. So currently the Aorus 5700 XT retails for £410 here in the UK, whereas the Gigabyte Gaming OC model retails for £375. That is a 10% increase, so what exactly do you get for the extra money? Well, we'll kick off this video with a look at the designs of both cards, as while there are some similarities as you would expect, there are also some pronounced differences. Starting with the Gaming OC then, we have seen this design a number of times over the last 18 months. It is pretty simple to look at. It's got a plain matte black plastic shroud with some grey accents on it as well. In my opinion, I do think this is a bit plain, as I mentioned, although obviously this is going to be subjective. It's my personal opinion. That said, I do really like the look of the Aorus card. First of all, it is all black, so there are no grey accents, which I think gives it a really stealthy look, and that coupled with its kind of more striking shroud design with its slightly more aggressive angles and edges, in my opinion at least, reminds me a little bit of the Batmobile, which I personally think is a good thing. Definitely in terms of pure shroud design, I do think the Gaming OC is a bit more plain, whereas the Aorus really steps it up and has a bit more of that kind of gamer aesthetic. One similarity between the two though definitely becomes apparent when looking at the fan design. That's because both cards use the Windforce 3X overall cooler design, which means we've got triple fans on each card and they each use the same blade design. On top of that, they both use what Gigabyte dubs the alternate spinning technology. So essentially, with both graphics cards, the central fan actually spins in reverse compared to the outer two, and Gigabyte says this should reduce overall turbulence and thus increase airflow pressure. The only real difference when it comes to the fans is a very slight difference in size, with the Gaming OC's fans measuring at 80mm, while the Aorus fans are 82mm. Speaking of a difference in size, the Aorus is clearly the larger card. In fact, its dimensions come in at 290 by 123 by 58mm, when compared to the Gaming OC, that comes in at 279.85 by 114.35 by 49.55mm. So really what that means is the Aorus isn't that much longer, it's about a centimetre longer, but it is noticeably thicker and it is also noticeably taller. It's about 9mm taller and 9mm thicker. So not only does that mean it is a true triple slot card, it is also quite tall. So if you were thinking of maybe putting this in a smaller chassis, then the Gaming OC might have better compatibility. Moving now on to the front side of each card. Here both have RGB zones. So on the Gigabyte Gaming OC, it's just a small Gigabyte logo which is an RGB zone, and in fact that is the only RGB zone on the card as a whole, so it's really quite a minimalist RGB implementation. For the Aorus card, however, it again has an RGB Aorus logo on the front side, but it has the addition of two LED strips around the fan, so this adds just a little bit extra bling. I still wouldn't call it a very kind of in-your-face or over-the-top RGB implementation. Certainly we have seen some other cards over the last few months which are definitely, you know, a bit more full-on RGB, but that is something to consider. If you do want maybe a more RGB heavy card, then you would be probably going for the Aorus. Additionally, the Aorus card also has another feature on its front side which is simply not present on the Gaming OC, and I'm talking about a dual BIOS switch. So the Gaming OC only has one BIOS, whereas the Aorus you can flick between the OC BIOS and also the silent BIOS. I really do like this feature. Not only does it give the card a bit more versatility in that you can choose whether you want the high factory overclock core, maybe slightly louder fan noise, or you can dial it down with the silent BIOS and completely reduce that fan noise. But on top of that, it also just gives you an extra bit of peace of mind, some extra redundancy. Say you were flashing one of the BIOSes, should that brick it, you do have a second one to fall back on, whereas the Gaming OC, you simply don't have that option. Moving on though, both cards do have metal backplates, which I certainly appreciate, but in keeping with the overall design language of each card, the backplate design on the gaming OC is definitely much plainer. It's only home to a single Gigabyte logo, and other than that it really is just a plain piece of metal. With the Aorus backplate, however, not only can you see the Aorus Eagle logo etched into the metal itself, there is also some more Aorus branding and a little bit more text just underneath that. So that, coupled with some of the lines and the ridges cut into the metal, definitely again gives it a bit more of an aggressive appearance, which is missing from the gaming OC. That said, it is good to see that both have full-length metal backplates, so it's really not a negative point in either direction. Other points to note now include the power connectors. Here the gaming OC needs just one 8-pin and one 6-pin power connectors, so that is the same as the reference 5700 XT. However, for the Aorus card you will need two 8-pins, so that is 1 point of difference. Additionally, we can also get a look at the display outputs. For the gaming OC it has 3 display ports and then 1 HDMI, whereas the Aorus increases this to 3 display ports and 3 HDMI, so you do get a couple more ports with the Aorus card. So despite those differences, when we come to look at the PCBs for each graphics card, it's interesting that they both share essentially the same design. That means both cards actually have a 7-phase VRM for the GPU, and both cards also have a 2-phase VRM for the memory. Speaking of the memory, here both cards are using 14 gigabit per second modules from Micron. Obviously we have already mentioned the dual BIOS switch, which is a plus point in favour of the Aorus, but I definitely have to say when looking at the PCBs I was expecting to see the Aorus maybe have a more beefed up VRM, or at least something else to kind of differentiate it from the gaming OC, but ultimately that just isn't the case. We can see more of a difference though when comparing the cooler design. Not only is the Aorus card just larger, we already mentioned that, so it has a thicker heatsink which is also heavier. For instance, the Aorus heatsink weighs in at 778 grams, whereas the gaming OC heatsink weighs 596 grams. On top of that, we can also see that the Aorus has an extra heat pipe, so that card has a total of 6 6mm copper heat pipes, whereas the gaming OC has 5 6mm copper heat pipes. Apart from those differences though, in both cases those heat pipes make direct contact with the GPU die, and we can also see that both coolers have dedicated cold plates for the memory as well as the VRM. So that is where we are going to leave our look at the overall designs. I think we've established a few similarities, but then also a number of differences between the two cards. Now we're going to move on to gaming performance. So in this video we're going to be focusing on a few titles at both 1080p and 1440p resolutions, though as always if you do want to see all the games we tested across all the resolutions you can head over to kitguru.net. Just before we do dive into the results, it's worth giving you the rated game clocks for each card, just to give you a bit of context so you can kind of know what to expect. So for the gaming OC, that has a rated game clock at 1795 MHz, while the Aorus ups this all the way to 1905 MHz. So Battlefield 5 is our first game of the day, and here the performance gains for the Aorus card aren't huge. At 1080p, both 5700 XTs are outperforming the RTX 2070 Super, but the Aorus is just 1% faster than the Gigabyte gaming OC. These margins do change as the resolution steps up to 1440p though, but not by much. Both cards are still marginally faster than the 2070 Super, but the Aorus holds a 2% lead now over the gaming OC. On the other hand, we see a reasonably significant difference between the two 5700 XTs when playing The Division 2. I've noted previously how this game responds strongly to an increase in clock speed, and that certainly benefits the Aorus RX 5700 XT here. At 1080p, that card is 4% faster than the gaming OC. At 1440p now, that difference actually increases to a 5% performance lead for the Aorus card. That being said, both 5700 XTs do come in slower than the 2070 Super in this title. Playing F1 2019 now at 1080p doesn't really show much of a difference between the two 5700 XT cards, as there is barely a 2% difference between the Aorus and the gaming OC. At 1440p, however, the Aorus card can stretch its legs a bit more and make use of its increased clock speed. While it is still slower than the 2070 Super at this resolution, the Aorus card is only 1% slower. The gaming OC, on the other hand, is 5% slower than the Nvidia card, so we can really see that the Aorus is closing the gap on the 2070 Super. As we've seen in a couple of other titles so far, the difference between our two RX 5700 XTs isn't huge when gaming at 1080p in Gears 5, as there's just a 2% gap between the Aorus and the gaming OC at this resolution. However, again, once we step up to 1440p, we can see the Aorus take another 4% lead over the gaming OC. This is enough to put the Aorus card on equal footing with the 2070 Super, while the gaming OC is still a couple frames slower. Red Dead Redemption 2 now is another interesting game for this comparison. Despite being a graphically intensive modern title, the Aorus's extra clock speed doesn't really bring it much benefit. At both 1080p and 1440p, the Aorus is only 2% faster than the gaming OC, which comes in as two of the smallest performance differences we have seen today. The last game we're going to look at today is Total War 3 Kingdoms. This game did scale well with increased clock speed, as we saw the Aorus 5700 XT come in 4% faster than the gaming OC across both 1080p and 1440p resolutions. This still isn't enough to match the 2070 Super, however, but where the gaming OC is 14% slower than the 2070 Super at 1440p, the Aorus is instead 11% slower, so it is definitely closing the gap slightly. So overall, based on the games we just looked at, I'm sure it's no surprise really to hear that, on average, the Aorus is actually 4% faster than the gaming OC. Both cards are still on average slower than the RTX 2070 Super, but where the gaming OC is 6% slower on average, the Aorus is only 3% slower on average. So while it still may not be fully as fast as the 2070 Super across all of our titles, it definitely does help close the gap on that card, whereas the gaming OC does lag slightly further behind. That is where we're going to leave our gaming testing though. As mentioned, head over to kitguru.net if you want to see all the games we tested at 1080p, 1440p and 4K. But for now, we're going to dive into our temperature testing. This is a particularly interesting area to look at, particularly when directly comparing the OC BIOS and the silent BIOS on the Aorus card. We'll come to that in a bit though, as the first thing to point out really is that the gaming OC and the Aorus both perform very well here in terms of their temperatures. The Aorus does have marginally lower edge and memory temperatures, but both sets of results are still impressive, and I really wouldn't say there's much between the two. Looking at the Aorus silent BIOS, however, there we can see that card hit a junction temperature of 100 degrees, while memory temperature also increased up to 90 degrees as a result of the lower fan speed. Both results are still technically in spec, but they are also quite high, so I would have liked to see the BIOS run the clock speed down a little bit slower, maybe around the 1800 MHz mark, to help keep these temperatures down a bit. As it is, I would recommend sticking with the OC BIOS if you do want to maintain those lower temperatures. The benefit to the silent BIOS, however, is immediately noticeable, where we see peak noise readings coming in below 37 decibels. This is about 5 decibels less than the same card using its OC BIOS, and while even that result still isn't really loud, it is definitely audibly louder than the card using its silent BIOS. As for the gaming OC, it is a little bit quieter than the Aorus while using its OC profile, but really not by much. There we saw its 3 fans spin at 41% under load, or around 1740 RPM. Again, it is a good result. It's slightly quieter than the Aorus OC, but there are quieter graphics cards out there. Lastly, we come to power draw. It's no surprise to see here that the Aorus 5700 XT, when using its OC BIOS, does pull the most power, with our total system power draw coming in at over 350 watts for that card. Switching to the silent BIOS does drop power consumption by about 20 watts, which incidentally is almost identical to the power draw of the gaming OC. Considering the extra clock speed that both cards offer over the reference 5700 XT, I would say these results are pretty much as expected. We're also going to touch on manual overclocking for both cards, and honestly here I wasn't really expecting much. I was initially hoping that the Aorus would be able to overclock better, but when we took the cards apart and saw that they are essentially using the same PCBs, I really wasn't expecting too much. That being said, both cards were able to hit 900 MHz or 15.2 gigabit per second on the memory, while the core on the Aorus was able to hit 2150 MHz, while we had to settle for 2110 MHz for the gaming OC. In the real world, this saw the Aorus run about 60 MHz faster in our average clock speed testing, where we saw it hit 2050 MHz, while the gaming OC came in just shy of that 2 GHz mark, with its core running around 1990 MHz. Unsurprisingly, that meant we did see the Aorus still outperforming the gaming OC in our 3D Mark benchmarks and also in some of the games we tested at 1440p, but due to its extra frequency, the gaming OC does close the gap significantly to the point where really both cards were performing at essentially the same level. In all three games we retested as well, this manual overclock was enough for both 5700 XTs to surpass stock 2070 Super performance. So then, that is really going to do it for our head-to-head comparison between Gigabyte's gaming OC 5700 XT and the Aorus 5700 XT. As we mentioned at the beginning of the video, for those who don't know, Aorus is Gigabyte's premium sub-brand, so we would expect the Aorus card to be overall a slightly better performer, but it does also come with a higher price tag. At the time of filming, this Aorus card retails for £410, while the gaming OC is £375. So what do you get for your extra money? Well, the way I see it, there are two main advantages for the Aorus card and then a few other more minor points which we'll also discuss. Starting with those significant advantages though for the Aorus card, the first thing I would say is just out of the box clock speed. Here we saw the Aorus card running about 110-115 MHz faster than the gaming OC, giving it on average a 4% performance lead over this card. The second main point to mention as well is the onboard dual BIOS support. I already talked about this earlier, but it is definitely a really good feature. It is something I value highly, both for the versatility it gives and also for the peace of mind. In case you do brick one of the BIOS, you have a second one there ready to go. There are also some other points to mention if you're deliberating between which card to get. One of those would be temperature testing, as we did see the Aorus card running slightly cooler, but then again we do also have to remember that the gaming OC is physically smaller, so there is definitely scope to put this in a wider range of cases, as the Aorus may not fit in everything. Additionally, I personally do prefer the overall look of the Aorus card, though that is obviously subjective. Overall then, if you are wondering which card to buy, I have to be honest and say I don't necessarily think one card is outright better than the other. For instance, many people will see that the gaming OC is £35 cheaper, it still has a very solid cooler, so they would just go with that card as the better value option. Speaking personally though, I would be prepared to pay the extra £35 for the Aorus OC, both for that dual BIOS, the increased clock speed, and like I said, I do just prefer the overall look. But overall, I do think it does come down to what feature set you want and how much you are prepared to pay, as there's definitely a market for both cards. It really does just depend on your priorities. Anyway guys, that is going to do it for this video. If you liked it, you can toss us a thumbs up. If you are looking at a 5700 XT, would it be either of these cards? Do let me know down in the comments. Additionally, you can also check out our merch store where you can pick up t-shirts like this. And if you'd like to join us on our Discord server, you can also check a link to that in the description below. Lastly, it would also be awesome if you guys would consider backing us on Patreon. There you can see a number of our videos early, and you also get exclusive access to some giveaways. Recently we just gave away a 5700 XT itself, so that is definitely something to consider. Until then though guys, I'm Dominic for Kit Guru, and I'll see you in the next video.